I want to thank everybody for joining us. My name's Jeff Morris, and I'm the chapter director for the Redwood chapter of the Sierra Club. I hope you're all surviving well in these unusual times, and they certainly are unusual. One of our panelists has been traveling quite a bit in the last 24 hours, and I'm looking forward to hearing how it is out there. First off, I'd like to thank the Redwood chapter team for helping us get this organized. Victoria Brandon, who's our chapter chair, Shoshana Hebshi, who's our communications coordinator, Jacob Klein, the newest staff addition to the Redwood chapter, who's been helping us run through the technical details of this platform. And Jacob's also going to be helping facilitate some questions today and gathering those for our Q&A session. This is the first in what we hope will be a series of Redwood chapter chats online and this platform. So you can follow us on social media for more information on that. We'll also be sending out some information following this session. But for today, we are thrilled to bring three powerhouse climate voices together for an engaging discussion about the latest on climate science, national climate policy, what lies ahead for all of us, which, you know, I think uncertainty is probably the baseline statement for that, and suggested actions we can take, particularly at the local level. We've got at least 90 reservations for participants on Zoom today, and we're also going to be streaming live to our Facebook page, so a number of other people are going to be able to join us there. We'll hear from each of our three panelists, which will be followed at the end by a short Q&A session. And I'll be facilitating that, and moderator's discretion. I'll have a few questions myself at the front end of that, so I'm looking forward to interacting with the panelists myself. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. This almost feels like a Hollywood Squares format for the folks who are familiar with 1970s game shows. Directly on my screen, at least, directly below me is grateful to have him here, Representative Jared Huffman, who has represented our region in District 2 of California in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2012. And his recent accomplishment passed sweeping legislation through the House to protect thousands of acres of wilderness and wild and scenic rivers in our district has moved on to the U.S. Senate. And I'm personally very excited about that piece of legislation. Climate action champion, Mr. Huffman says that climate change is the greatest imperative of our time, and I think we're seeing that is certainly becoming to be true. And he is also co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. One of our other panelists, Linda Brown, is co-founder of Napa Climate Now, and a former member of the Redwood chapter's Napa Group's executive committee. She is co-founder and senior vice president of SCS Global Services, an innovative global leader in third-party environmental sustainability and food quality certification, auditing, testing, and standards development. And our third panelist, last but certainly not least, is Randy MacDonald. And Randy is the Redwood chapter's Climate and Energy Committee Chair and leader of its climate program, the Climate Protectors Program. And you can see the logo in the picture there behind Randy. A resident of rural Mendocino County, Randy MacDonald is a dedicated and passionate activist on climate change, and also has a history as a volunteer firefighter and a local community activist. So we're glad to have all three folks here. Very exciting. And so the sequence today, we're going to hear from Linda first, talking about the latest in climate science. And then we're going to transition to our Congressman, Jared Huffman, to talk about national climate policy and what's happening in DC, and hopefully what can happen in DC in the future. And then we'll transition to Randy MacDonald, who will have some information on things going locally. And then we'll do some Q&A. So Linda, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. And wanted to thank Jeff and Randy and Shoshana, Jacob, and Victoria for all the work they've done to rapidly put this really interesting group of folks together. I'm so excited to hear from Representative Huffman and from Randy, who's quite knowledgeable, and I'm so honored to be a part of this discussion today. So without further ado, I've been asked to talk about the climate science briefly, which is kind of hard for me to do, but I wanted to talk about it in the context of the current pandemic. So the first thing, we have lessons to be learned from the pandemic that we can apply to the climate crisis. And the first thing is addressing exponential change. We've all learned that we can't just sit by and watch the COVID crisis unfold, that early intervention dramatically reduces death. And here, for example, we see these were projections back in early April about the deaths that would occur from the COVID-19 from the coronavirus. And you can see they were projecting about 60,000 deaths with a wide range of error, way up to over 120,000. But by intervening just 1 week earlier, the deaths could be brought way down. And by intervening 2 weeks earlier, the deaths could be brought down by tenfold. And that goes to show that if you address an exponential issue, crisis rapidly, that you're going to have results. And if you wait, you're going to lose control. And we know within the climate issue, climate crisis, there's just no time to waste. All of you on the phone are more than familiar with all of these terrible impacts that we've witnessed, whether firsthand the wildfires here in Northern California and the droughts, or secondhand reading about the dying coral reefs, the rise in sea level, which we're experiencing on our coasts, and flooding events with atmospheric rivers and so forth. And all of this has been happening even though current global temperature rise has only reached a level of about 1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius above normal. That doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not the level that the Paris Agreement has set as the minimum target of 1.5 degrees. So we are already experiencing catastrophic events because these are exponential. And we know that to respond to exponential climate change, we have to act rapidly, we have to act courageously, we have to do things we've never done before, and we have to be innovative and think out of the box and not do things the way we've always done them. So the second lesson from the pandemic is the lesson about flattening the curve. And this has been good because the whole population has learned how effective it can be to take what could be an exponential rise that absolutely overwhelms the medical system and flatten that curve, as we've successfully done so far here in California, to stay within the limits of what our medical system can address. And it takes action by everyone. Shelter in place is not easy. The stress from all the things and actions we've had to take is not easy, and it's certainly not on our essential workforce. But it's something we recognize that we're all in this together, and we know how important flattening the curve is. Well, the same can be said about climate change. And here, for instance, is a simple graphic that shows the same exact thing. We're on an exponential curve with climate change, and this is literally going off the chart, literally because we have no idea. Humans have never lived with climate change as it's currently projected to go right now. We have got to flatten this curve. There is no vaccine to climate change. This is something that won't come down unless we attend to it. But if we level the curve, and that's what we're talking about, we're still on the upswing, but if we can do all the things we need to do to level the curve,
Hello?
we can hold the temperature. Can you
Hey,
hear me?
Steve. How you doing, bud?
Pardon?
Hey, folks, if you for some reason have your audio on or have called in, make sure to mute yourself. Thanks.
Okay, so you can hear me. Good. So we can certainly, and all of our objectives are aimed at flattening the curve below the levels set by Paris, whether it's the 2-degree level, the 1.5 degree aspirational level, or levels below that, which I would argue we need to do since we're already seeing such dramatic problems occur. Overshooting is not an option. When people talk about an overshoot, we've got to understand when we overshoot, we disrupt climate systems that will not come back into balance for thousands and thousands of years. Our lesson number 3 is understanding the lag time between cause and effect. This is a little bit more technical, and I'm going to unpack this, but to start, let me simply say this. We know from the pandemic that the incubation period between the initial infection and the onset of symptoms is about 2 to 14 days. So there's a lag time. We get infected and then we later have symptoms. Okay, during this time, the carrier can unknowingly spread the virus. Well, it's very similar in the case of climate change. There's a lag time between the time that the Earth's energy balance is changed and the years that go by before we see the consequences of that energy balance change. It's several years. And that lag time makes it very difficult for policymakers and especially for the population to really understand what's happening. So I'm unpacking that just to show you, if you haven't seen a chart like this before, when we talk about the Earth's energy balance, it's the equilibrium that the Earth has reached between incoming solar radiation and outbound heat. This is an equilibrium that we've lived with in a zone called the Goldilocks zone. I'm sure you've heard that term, which is the equilibrium that is sustainable for life as we know it. And greenhouse gases have always been a part of that. But now greenhouse gases have grown. And as they've grown, we have put the Earth's energy balance out of balance. That is measured, and I'm going to use one term, the only term I ask you to think about, because you need to know this going forward as a climate activist, is radiative forcing measured in watts per square meter over every square meter of the Earth. And that's what all these numbers on these charts are. So getting back to this cause and effect, the analogy I like to use is this one where you apply heat underneath a pot of cold water, and it takes time after you apply the heat before the water will boil. We're all familiar with that time, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever that time, it's a lag time. And so it's the same thing in climate. The more excess heat is trapped in our atmosphere, the more we see disruption to our climate, the more we damage the environment, and ultimately the higher temperatures will go, but it takes several years in between. So there are dangerous thresholds. Here's one threshold, 1.9 watts per square meter of radiative forcing. That will lead to temperatures over 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's that lower Paris limit target that they've set. Well, turns out we passed that in 2002. So we've passed this threshold a long time ago, 18 years ago. Here's another important threshold, 2.7 watts per square meter. You don't need to know these numbers, but you do know these numbers, 2 degrees Celsius. That's the Paris, that's the main goal of the Paris Accord. Do not, under any circumstances, exceed this level of global temperature rise. Well, we already baked enough heat into the system in 2017. That's this heat, right? That's what radiative forcing is, it's extra heat. We already put enough of that in the system in 2017 to pass this level. So what we know now is that we have already put enough heat in the atmosphere to pass both of these levels, and we have to bring these down immediately. The third part of this is we need to know how quickly it's going to happen. How quickly are we going to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, told us in 2018 that we could reach 1.5 degrees Celsius as early as 2030. And here it is. This is the report from the IPCC, and here is the very first conclusion in the report. And here it is in black and white, or in red and white here. Global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2052. And this bears repeating because this is where policy implications come from. It's not enough to talk about 2050 because we could reach this level by 2030. And anyone who tells you that 2050 is a good goal for, it's fine in the long run, but we've got to be much more aggressive in establishing policies and solutions so that we can not overshoot. Again, because we're on an exponential curve upward in our impacts, we can't afford to wait. So my fourth lesson is to base solutions on the best available science, and I hope that this speaks for itself. Nothing need be said further. Here's what we need to accomplish to reach climate stability, just leveling off the curve, and then ultimately achieve climate sustainability, which is bringing the curve back down. So here is the trajectory of added heat to the atmosphere. That's that radiative forcing again. Here's the line that represents what we need to do to hold the line, if you will, to hold temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. What's the difference? Here we are today, here we'll be in 2030. The difference is 1.4 watts per square meter. And don't forget, we're just at about 2.7 right now. We're going up to 3.3. If we've got to drop 1.4 off, well, you can visually see it right here. We don't just need to level things out right now. We actually need to reduce the added heat in the atmosphere this much just to stabilize, level the curve at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a complicated idea, but I hope that you can take away a little bit of what we're saying here about leveling the curve, just how much effort is involved. And that's just to get to 1.5 degrees. If we want to level the curve to levels that are more sustainable, we have to go even more. We have to do even more. And if we don't do this, the job gets harder and harder and harder the longer and farther we go. So what are the sources of radiative forcing change? Well, we all know about greenhouse gases. And the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is clearly the most important of those in terms of its contribution. After that is methane, nitrous oxide, and then other gases. And gases are one thing. And it's not just what we currently emit every year. It's also what's accumulated, because most of these gases last for a long time in the atmosphere. There is a tail, and they last and last and last. And so that means that the background concentration levels go up and up and up. And so when we're devising policy, it's not enough to talk about the current carbon footprint. We also need to account for and pull down that background concentration. So that's a much bigger task. The second source of radiative forcing is short-lived climate pollutants. Now, methane, which is a gas, is considered a short-lived pollutant because it only lasts for 12 years in the atmosphere. But others aren't even gases like black carbon, which comes out of smoke and diesel engines and industrial stacks. And this smoky particulate sooty stuff, it's much different in the way it behaves than a gas. And it has to be treated differently. And it's a very important source. Then there's the issue of carbon sequestration. As we farm poorly and as we as we deforest, then we're reducing the carbon stored in organic matter in our soils and in the organic matter, the wood or the living material. And finally, we have changes in albedo. Albedo is reflectivity, and anything that's a light surface, whether it's snow and ice or whether it's a white concrete, that will reflect, or white paint, it will reflect heat. If it's dark, if it's black asphalt, it's going to absorb heat. And if it's black particulate matter dropping on ice and snow, it's going to absorb heat and hasten the pace of climate change. So if we're going to have a real solution to our problem, we have to go looking beyond the issue of emissions here and here. Especially, we can't just look at greenhouse gas emissions. We have to look at the short-lived climate pollutants. We have to improve our carbon sequestration, and we have to stop this bleeding, of loss of reflectivity on the Earth's surface. And all of those are necessary. It's no longer possible to solve the climate crisis by focusing on emissions alone. I'm focusing here on the short-lived climate pollutants just to give you a little bit more depth, and then I'll be over in just a moment. So in addition to black carbon, which only lasts for days in the atmosphere and comes from these different sources, notice that its impacts are local because it's not a gas. It's only affecting a region or an area where it is. Its impacts globally are much less. Whereas methane, which lasts 12 years, still considered short-lived compared to other gases, has more of a global effect because it mixes in the atmosphere. Tropospheric ozone, the one you've never heard of, this is like ground level ozone, which causes smog, except that now the ozone has moved up a layer into the troposphere. This lasts for just a few weeks, and it's like having a magnifying glass. If you put this over the Central Valley, which happens from the pollution in the Central Valley from our oil and gas industry, that creates added heat right over the growing area of the Central Valley, which is really exacerbating things like drought and water depletion, water resource depletion. And then the hydrofluorocarbons, which like methane last for a few years in the atmosphere. So these are key to a short-term climate strategy over the next 10 years, because since they only last a few days, weeks, or a few years, if we cut these pollutants at the source, they are gone. We don't have that accumulation, that background concentration. It will go away. So if we have to be super laser focused on addressing these short-lived climate pollutants in the very near term, as well as focusing on carbon dioxide. So I wanted to say that lesson number 5, just like COVID-19, there's no shortage of common sense strategies. Of course, in the case of the pandemic, we should be testing, we should be sheltering in place, we should be wearing masks when we're in contact with other people, all the things that are simply common sense. Same thing is true in climate. We have lots and lots of strategies to reduce emissions. We have lots of strategies to improve the reflectivity of surfaces, and we have lots of strategies to restore the natural ability of our climate system to hold carbon. We have a combination of high-tech and low-tech solutions. They're off the shelf in many cases. They're emerging. There's all kinds of innovation going on. And so we know that solutions within our reach. It's really a question of the will and the money. And the money is a big deal, obviously, because we have to put the money where it's going to make the most difference. That's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Linda, that was great. Thank you so much. And we actually have in the chat box, a number of people asked if they might, we might be able to share slide programs after. So we'll do some follow-up email and get those out to participants. Congressman Huffman, thank you again. I was following your Twitter feed last night, and red eye and a vote this afternoon, and then showing up to our little party here. So thank you very much for your continued diligence.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's great to be with you, and I'm glad I got to hear Linda's excellent presentation. I've heard Linda present before, and she just does a great job of breaking down the science for lay people like many of us, helping us really grasp these concepts and illuminating some really intelligent paths forward. So appreciate that. Yes, I'm actually not done with voting. I'm in the middle of votes. So we've cast our first vote on about a $3 trillion piece of legislation that is being called the HEROES Act. And I'll have 2 more votes tonight before the night is done. And it has been a bit of a travel odyssey getting here. So if any of you don't have to fly, don't fly. This is a rotten time to fly. So the planes are packed, the circumstances are surreal. And, I've been thinking a lot about the parallels between the pandemic and the climate crisis. I was very interested to hear Linda's thoughts about lessons that transfer from one crisis to another. And how apropos, because I am literally talking to you about the climate crisis tonight as I'm legislating about the public health crisis. So we are grappling with these things simultaneously. We're trying our best to make sure that the climate crisis isn't completely pushed out of our consciousness and off of our agenda while we deal with this very all-consuming pandemic. It's tough because for the past 2 months, literally, Congress has been off the field. We were sidelined. We did not have contingencies in place to allow remote operations. The rules of the House are old. The institutions and the sensibilities are ossified, so we don't do change very well or very quickly. And literally just today, for the first time in history, we finally changed the rules of the House to now going forward allow remote proceedings. And we'll probably get sued by the Republicans over that, by the way. I have proposed in my subcommittee, my Water, Oceans, and Wildlife subcommittee, to start doing virtual hearings. I want to do one on what the pandemic is doing to fishing communities and to folks that depend on the marine environment, and some of the risks that we're facing in Alaska as seafood processing season begins, and you see all these migrant workers showing up, and it has the potential to be another one of these meat packing plant scenarios in the slime lines and the boats and these other places that become so very crowded every summer in Alaska. So I thought, here's a very nonpartisan subject. I'll propose a virtual hearing, and my Republican colleagues will join me in the spirit of, just being adults. Well, not so. My ranking member, Tom McClintock, was very quick to poo-poo the whole thing and calls it extra constitutional. Reminded me that the framers were very specific in the Constitution. They said that Congress shall meet. And how thoughtless of them not to make note of virtual meeting technology in the late 1780s. What were they thinking? So yes, these are the preposterous pretexts that we hear for Republicans, basically just trying to grind the work of Congress to a halt by using this pandemic. But we are slowly but surely, animating these new procedures and technologies. And I think we'll get back to business in some meaningful ways. The Climate Crisis Select Committee that I serve on also was kind of held in abeyance. We were going to have released our report by now, but that stopped. We've not only been unable to conclude it, but we have been rethinking some parts of it, because I think the pandemic challenges you to make sure you're considering this new experience and the possible frames that might apply to the climate crisis. So we're going to take a little more time with the report from the Select Committee, but we are continuing to push forward. We may have another hearing or two, and I suspect in coordination with Leader Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, trying to just figure out what's the best time to make our splash on climate, but it'll be this summer, I believe, sometime. So stay tuned on that. Just yesterday, I had a video conference with the head of the COP26 climate conference, a gentleman, a very experienced minister in London. And we talked about the fact that what may seem like a setback, the fact that this pandemic has kind of ground everything to a halt, and it even required the postponement of the Glasgow conference, which was going to be in December. We talked about the fact that it's actually probably the best thing that could happen right now for global efforts on climate change, because we were going to have the Trump administration, having formally withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, be our representatives. And that was going to just have a terrible effect, a paralyzing effect on the rest of the world. Now we have an opportunity, because this won't happen until next spring at the earliest. I'm going to be working with Peter Hill and others, the convener of COP26, and making sure that we have a great delegation, from Congress and at the subnational level. We talked a little bit about the fact that, we don't like to think about Trump winning re-election, but if he does, we still got to find a way to make progress. It just becomes a very adversarial strategy, basically consisting of the rest of the world and the US at the subnational level versus the Trump administration in a no-holds-barred fight for the planet. I would much rather have it be the whole world together with a new administration really taking some major leaps forward on ambition and commitments. So, as with so many things we care about, this election will determine, which of those paths we're on. And I'm very grateful to be working with all of you. I think I'll wrap it at that point, Jeff. I don't have any organized presentation for you. I'm just giving you a little riffing here from Washington, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have.
Well, that's great, Jared. Just having you on, being able to know that we've got somebody in our district and at the national level that has these goals in our best interest and honestly the world's best interests at heart right now. It's good to have that level of certainty where certainty is in short supply in many ways. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A too, because I think this is gonna be fascinating for all of us to exchange among ourselves and also hear some questions from our audience. With that, I'd like to introduce Randy MacDonald, who is the chair of our climate committee for the Redwood chapter of the Sierra Club. And Randy has got some thoughts on how you can get involved as individuals on the local level and take actions to support climate and helping us move forward collectively. Randy.
Right on. Thank you, Jeff. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. It's such an honor to follow my congressman, as well as my colleague, Linda Brown, both of whom are real climate heroes in my book. What I'd like to do is take a few minutes to share with you some information I have here on climate change and what we can do about it. So let me get that going. Jeff, is that showing?
Yep, looks like you're good to go.
Great, all right. So let's get started with the message from our mother, Earth. This is a NASA image of the Arctic from last summer, September 18. That's the day when the Arctic sea ice last year, that white floating mass, had melted to its minimum extent, which happens every year. Surrounding last year's sea ice is a red line indicating the average minimum area of sea ice between 1981 and 2010. And as Linda pointed out, that's no longer reflective, that's now absorbing area. It's shocking to see how much the Arctic sea ice has declined since that time. This scientific evidence leaves no doubt that global warming is real, and we're already seeing terrible consequences of climate change all around us. Climate change is happening faster, and its impacts are more severe than had been predicted. The world is not on track to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as Linda's chart showed, and as this diagram indicates, 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So the world's leading climate scientists warned that exceeding 1.5 degrees will dangerously destabilize our climate, as you just heard Linda say. And as this chart shows, we must cut our emissions in half this decade to be on track to reach net zero carbon pollution by 2050. But as Linda pointed out, that's not all we have to do. Everyone, countries, cities, the private sector, individuals will need to strengthen their action without delay, says the World Resources Institute. So in face of all this dire information, how can we have hope that this will happen? There is hope. My hope that we can protect our climate rose dramatically when this young woman made herself known to the world a couple of years ago. Greta Thunberg was a Swedish high school student who discovered through her studies that the world was not doing what was necessary to halt global warming and protect our environment. And she knew that this would irreparably harm her own future and that of her generation. So, while still keeping up with her studies, Greta launched a school strike for climate every Friday outside Sweden's parliament building. Other young people around the world began to follow her lead, which led to millions of new climate activists joining the climate movement. Thunberg testified before the United Nations General Assembly and many other places around the globe, calling out world leaders for their failure to protect our climate and our environment. Then, on September 20th last year, Thunberg and more than 4 million others around the planet staged the largest climate strike in history. Their huge rising up showed the world that young people will not accept the betrayal of their future, and we must rise with them to make sure that everything necessary is done to protect the climate and environment that they will inherit. Greta and her young colleagues joined our climate movement, which is already underway around the world and here in the United States. Did you know that more than 100 million Americans live in communities which have committed to convert over to use 100% clean, renewable, equitable energy by the middle of the century? Well, it's true. And that great news is thanks to the Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign, through which grassroots activists and communities across our nation have won commitments by their governments to 100% clean, renewable, just and equitable energy by 2050. And those activists are making sure their governments make good on their commitments, showing us all that even in the absence of federal action, Americans are rising up to make sure we protect our climate and the environment. But there's even more good news, more reasons to have hope for our climate. The International Climate Mobilization Movement has persuaded 1,486 governments in 28 countries to declare climate emergencies. These jurisdictions represent 829 million people around the world. And when governments declare those climate emergencies, it's up to climate activists like you and me to make sure they develop emergency action plans and implement real climate solutions. Speaking of emergencies, COVID-19. The coronavirus pandemic has stopped humanity in our tracks, killing hundreds of thousands, devastating families, pressing our healthcare system to its limits, and strangling the world economy. But as terrible as the pandemic crisis is, and it is, our climate crisis will bring about far worse destruction if we don't act now to restore a stable climate and a healthy environment. What can the climate movement learn from the pandemic? Well, you saw this graph a moment ago on Linda's presentation. One helpful development is that a large portion of the world's population now understands how important it is to, quote, flatten the curve of exponential threats like COVID-19 and climate change, both of which have exponentiating characteristics, in order to find a way through those crises. Acting together to flatten the curve of an exponential threat helps us to collectively better survive that threat. This is something that humanity is really getting its head around. This knowledge will help people better understand why it's critically important to flatten the curve of our carbon pollution. The chart on the left shows various scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. Humanity has been racing up the highest curve towards our own destruction. However, our response to the pandemic has shown that we can dramatically and rapidly reduce fossil fuel usage. We just need to learn how to do so sustainably. The graph on the right shows that taking real action on climate will have huge beneficial consequences for humanity and life on Earth. So even in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, humans are learning important lessons which we must apply to our climate crisis. Everyone is at risk. Everyone must act. We can dramatically change the world in a very short time, and we're all in this together. So this is the background of hope for our climate and the rising up of the climate movement into which our Climate Protectors program was born. Our goal for Climate Protectors is to inspire and implement community-based climate action. So I'd hope that you would visit our website at climateprotectors.net. The .net emphasizes that we are a network of local climate activists. Climate Protectors is a project of the Sierra Club's Redwood chapter, which covers California's 9 northwestern counties. Our focus right now is to build our Climate Protectors network throughout the Redwood chapter region. And if we're successful, our program can become a model that other regions may want to adopt. The Sierra Club's motto is explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. And we are totally committed to protecting Earth's precious climate. So what is a climate protector? A climate protector is someone who takes the climate crisis seriously enough to learn the science of climate change so their actions are based on a solid factual foundation. Take steps in our own lives to minimize our contributions to global warming and network with others, locally and beyond, to implement effective climate policies. So what do climate protectors do? Well, we take steps to reduce our own carbon footprint. We do what we can to reduce our carbon footprint and that of our households so that we can stand as role models in our climate advocacy and making a difference in our own life. Climate protectors learn about the problems in our local area that contribute to climate change and the opportunities that exist to take local action which makes a difference for our climate. Then we prioritize those actions which will have the most positive impact for our climate. Climate protectors develop constructive relationships with local elected officials and public sector staff to advocate for better policies which impact our climate, just as these members of the Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign in Elon, North Carolina have done. Here they are celebrating their climate progress with local officials. And having been a local elected official, I can tell you it's far too rare that a city councilor hears from a constituent. You can have an outsized influence on your local elected officials because there's not that many constituents per official. Climate protectors identify and build relationships with local climate allies, finding ways to work together when practical and supporting one another's efforts whenever possible. These are just a few of the many climate groups in our region which we will collaborate with. There's strength in numbers. Climate protectors help make sure that accurate information about our climate is being taught in our schools. We also seek out motivated students who want to get involved in our efforts. And we support the adoption of strong climate policies by the governing boards of schools and colleges. Climate protectors support farmers and landowners to enhance natural carbon storage through wise forest management and regenerative agriculture. And we encourage residents to responsibly develop the abundant clean energy resources widely available in rural areas. Climate protectors help educate, motivate, and empower local companies, groups, and people in general to become climate champions. This builds momentum for our work because when the people rise up, our leaders must listen. So that's a brief overview of our Climate Protectors program. I hope you visit our website at climateprotectors.net, and I hope you'll decide to join us and become a climate protector. If you're more interested in influencing state policy and programs related to climate change, I'm happy to report that Sierra Club California is working hard on these issues, and we need your help at the state level too. Here's just a partial list of areas and agencies our statewide Sierra Club Energy and Climate Committee has been involved with in just this past year. If you'd like to join the committee, please visit the committee's website and sign up to get involved. In addition to the URL you see here, you can also find the committee through our Climate Protectors website.
Quick note to start the Q&A. Our honored guest, Representative Huffman, has to get back to the House he's got to bail out of here in a few minutes. So we want to get to the Q&A as soon as we can. And so I'm going to start that off. Jared, what can you tell us about the projects on the fast track list for approval by Trump, and what can we do to assure proper environmental processes are followed with that?
Forgot my mute. There we go. There's actually just a ton of things, as you might imagine, where this administration, incompetent as they are when it comes to the things we really need them to do, like provide a national testing strategy and address our PPE stockpiles and follow the law. The one thing they're really good at is the stuff we hate, and that is moving really bad things forward and rolling back environmental safeguards. So all of that is happening right in the midst of this pandemic in a big way. You may have read that just yesterday, this atrocious EPA Secretary, Andrew Wheeler, announced that he's going to reverse something that was set in motion under the Obama administration to simply set a safe drinking water standard for perchlorate, which is a product of jet fuel and military activities. And it's a big health threat to young kids and developing brains. And it's all over the United States, and all the scientists and public health experts, many of the states and water providers around the country take it very seriously. The Trump administration says it's really overblown and we don't need to do anything about it. So we'll have to fight them as they try to do that kind of reverse rulemaking to pull our standards down. And they're doing that across the board. They're doing it with mercury in the air for power plants, even as power plants around the country had already invested and come into compliance with standards. They're going to lower those standards anyway. They're doing it with our public lands. So even though you've got oil at these really low levels, which is great, nobody wants to develop oil right now, they're pushing ahead with lease sales off the Outer Continental Shelf and in places like the Arctic Refuge. They just offered a massive area offshore for new leases. They didn't get much interest, as you might imagine, with $20 a barrel oil, but there's always some bottom feeders that'll come along and for pennies lock in lease rights that will require us to someday buy them out and pay them if we're going to protect areas and keep fossil fuel in the ground. And that, for me, is particularly an issue in the Arctic Refuge. They are still committed to having a lease sale in the Arctic Refuge with $20 barrel oil in a place where nobody's even done the seismic. We're not even sure where the reserves are. All of the major lenders in this country, from Goldman to Bank of America, and I think even Wells Fargo now, have said they won't finance drilling in the Arctic. So you're going to just get real bottom feeders with sketchy financing. They're going to offer pennies to lock up these property rights that will stand in our way going forward. And someday the taxpayers will have to buy them out so we can protect this place. Because you got to have at least $50 a barrel oil to even break even when in a place like the Arctic, and we're a long way from that right now. So yeah, fighting all of those fronts. And the short answer, how do we fight it? We got to sue. We got to get Congress back on the field with these oversight hearings we haven't been able to hold, so we can shine a bright light. We got to use our friends in the media to educate the American people, to stir the outrage that is should be necessary. And then kind of back to Randy's point, we got to take all that into the election and win.
Yeah, a couple of other questions came in during that answer that related. Do you foresee being able to undo or redo what the Trump administration has undone in terms of regulatory protection?
Well, it's going to vary. There are some things that are very easily undone. There are executive orders that can be undone by executive orders. I mentioned the Paris Agreement. Very hard and slow for them to pull us out of it, and very easy and quick for a President Biden to put us right back into it. So there's a lot that we can do very quickly, first 100-day kind of actions, but there's a lot that's going to take a long time to unwind. I mean, reanimating the Clean Power Plan, and that's not even good enough. We're going to have to do a lot more than the Clean Power Plan or the Waters of the United States rulemaking. If we, depending on how these congressional elections go, we can use a tool called the Congressional Review Act and actually go in and quickly override bad rulemaking from the Trump administration. There's pros and cons about doing that, but it requires a supermajority vote. And so once again, some of that and how we address it is going to depend on how well we do in the election.
Yeah. A few other questions. Are there any kind of regulations being worked into the HEROES Act or other pending pieces of legislation that will support some of the positive effects that we've actually, the strange silver linings we've seen from COVID-19? If you look at the San Gabriels from downtown LA right now, it's shocking how well you can see the mountains. Are you getting a sense that there are any of those measures being thought about or implemented into any of this legislation? I know it's again a strange political time as well.
Short answer, it won't be in this act. This act is going to be about pushing triage, mission critical funding to state and local governments and frontline healthcare workers, providing more money for unemployment and for this paycheck protection program and other urgent needs. We are, though, working on, I think, a really, for congressional standards, a really bold and forward-looking and climate-friendly infrastructure package that will include some of those things, and we're determined to get that into one of the next waves of legislation. Whether it can happen with Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, I don't know. But we'll try to get as much as we can, and glad to take that case to the voters too, because these are things that are broadly beneficial and really popular.
Yeah, and then probably a final question for the congressman and Jared. Thank you so much for being here. We respect you. We respect the work you're doing, locally and nationally. And I was telling our crew before this Zoom call today, I had another phone call where your ears were probably burning because we were talking about you. Just personally, I so appreciate your combination of compassion and Muhammad Ali fighting spirit at the same time. You're not afraid to throw punches, but you're also there to do the right thing for people in the environment. So really appreciate everything you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a beautiful comparison. I'm humbled. Muhammad Ali must have been an environmentalist because he talked about floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee. So he was speaking our language, I think. I back at you. I have enjoyed and appreciated working with many of you and certainly with the Sierra Club for a long time, and they continue to be just critical allies. If I could take a point of privilege, since I've got to run cast a vote, there is a really big local issue that I hope is on the Sierra Club's radar because we need to work together on this. I've been working for about the last 2.5 years to try to do something really big on the Eel River in the context of the relicensing of the Potter Valley project. I've convened this 2-basin ad hoc group. I've been herding cats and moving people gradually toward what I've called a 2-basin solution. And we now have this really interesting moment where folks who have been diverting water from the Eel River into the Russian for the past 100 years are now on board removing Scott Dam, one of the tallest hydro dams in California, as a matter of fact, and one that will open up hundreds of miles of great quality salmonid habitat and help be part of a real revival of the Eel River. And to do it in a way that continues a run of the river diversion for the Russian basin, a real win-win. And we're going to get mighty fierce resistance to this from Lake County. So I flagged this for you because I know your chapter includes Lake County and you've got some great environmentalists there. My elected colleagues in Lake County, folks like Senator Mike McGuire and Mike Thompson, John Garamendi, they need to know that there is support for doing this in Lake County too, because all they hear is the other side of the equation. Into the world, they're trying to take out a dam. And it will just be critical for there to be an environmental, an organic, local environmental voice on this from Lake County. So I wanted to flag that.
Right.
I know Victoria's in Lake County and you've got others there. Please get active, be vocal, happy to work with you and bring you up to speed in whatever way we can. But this is a big and really exciting opportunity. And the one thing that could still screw it up is Lake County.
Well, we're there for you 100% on that. I know that it's been a long project for many of our activists in the region too. So
Thank you. And let me just clarify, I think this is actually really good for Lake County. You know, you're going to get a wild river.
Sure.
It's going to bring jobs and restoration work and, you know, all sorts of beneficial things economically and environment to Lake County too. So it's not like we're rolling them, and we need allies on the ground.
Yep, you got it. We'll be there for you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, Jared. Everybody else, we're going to hang on here and take a few more questions. I know there's a few in the queue for Linda for sure. So let me pop over there and grab those. 1 second. Linda, a couple of questions. What do you think can be done to reduce the excess heat from the atmosphere?
Well, that's a big question. The thing that I mentioned toward the end of my presentation that has to do with albedo is one of those areas. We can do things like improve the reflectivity of our surfaces, and that is street surfaces, roof surfaces, and other playground surfaces. And there are experiments with that. There are projects around the world that are doing things like, they're called white streets or white roofs or green roofs, which are better than dark roofs, which can have, you know, added benefits. There are a lot of those types of projects that will increase reflectivity. And if we were to deploy those at scale, we would see percentages knocked off of the radiative forcing. It's not trivial. More importantly, in areas where we have pollution that is bringing black carbon soot particulate and causing it to fall onto ice and snow surfaces, any of the low-tech projects that are basically just applying basic pollution prevention technology, very inexpensive, or changing burning cycles like agricultural burning so that you're not burning during a time when that's going to transport over to areas that have ice and snow, the Himalayan plateau, the Arctic region, other glacier areas, or areas of snowpack. So addressing these short-lived climate pollutants couldn't be more important for helping to restore albedo. And albedo is one of the critical ways that we can help restore the Earth's equilibrium and pull down atmospheric heat. So that's an example.
Great, thank you for that. Is it accurate to say that the ppm of CO2 is now at 416? Are we at that level now? I don't know if you're tracking that.
I think that's correct. That's the last number I heard.
Okay.
And CO2, again, that really reflects the issue of accumulation of background concentration, that it's not that number that and I couldn't emphasize this more. If you look at the annual carbon footprint of a state or a country or an entity, its annual carbon footprint from carbon dioxide is a fraction of its larger carbon footprint from all the pollution CO2 it's been putting out there that's still in the atmosphere today. So we need to look at that fraction of the past emissions that still contribute to climate change today and target our actions on reducing that level. That's why another way to reduce heat is through carbon sequestration, and reducing CO2 depends on us having reforestation, not just ending deforestation, but healthy, strong policies that protect our woodlands and our forests and our wildlands and our meadows and all the aspects of our wild areas that provide not only carbon climate services, but all kinds of eco services, protecting our watersheds, protecting from erosion, protecting species, all the things that Sierra Club stands for.
So thank you for that answer. Interesting question about life cycles of perceived solutions or actual solutions. You know, and I think this is interesting myself. So for both you and Randy, electric vehicles, is as part of a reduction of emissions. Is there still a life cycle challenge with the production of those in terms of, birth to death evolution of any individual electric car? And what's the impact of that? I mean, we're already producing fossil fuel cars. So,
I can start, and then Randy, do you have something to add? Would you like to speak to that as well?
Right, I'll follow you, Linda.
Okay, so the company I work for conducts life cycle assessment studies, and one study that we recently conducted was on comparing the electric car to the standard gasoline powered car. Well, of course, there's no one car. There are cars in different classes, weight classes. And as it turned out in the recent research that we did on this, some of the lighter weight electric vehicles were very competitive from a life cycle standpoint against the 38 mile per gallon, which is high, gasoline powered vehicle, but that was the standard that was used. Were very competitive. Others, the heavier weight, classy luxury electric cars simply were not. The more we can, the more we can build out the battery storage, the more we can create ways to not draw on the electric power grid. The lower we can bring down emissions. In terms of production, yeah, there are some real issues, especially in terms of minerals that are rare minerals that go into these batteries. So that's a challenge. I'm not an expert in this area, but I do know that it's not a done deal that an electric car is automatically a better choice. It will be important for us to marry any measures to electrify. And I know that this is really important to the audience. Electrify everything is kind of the mantra now, and we need to go there, but we can't do that unless we're simultaneously getting fossil fuels out of our electricity system and building battery storage and other means of reducing emissions.
That's great. I just wanted to add that, and I saw that Tom Conlon's here as a participant, and I'm kind of channeling what I know he'd say. Electrify everything, but let's reduce demand first. Let's be as frugal as we can around our energy usage. Just 100 years ago, people were living quite differently and a lot more sustainably in a lot of ways. We've so been bought into by the material culture and all the quote unquote development that it's sometimes easy to overlook that, if you have to use a vehicle, it may well be better to use an electric vehicle, but look at the whole balance. But do you have to use you have to drive somewhere? Or could you take a bike? Could you catch a ride with someone else? All of a sudden you have the impact of that transport. Also, one great concern I have is what is COVID-19 going to mean for public transportation? That's a huge, wonderful way to reduce impact, vehicle miles traveled, et cetera. But how are we going to make sure public transport's safe, and how are we going to help the public be able to embrace that again? These are huge challenges we're facing. But what we're doing today is also a way to reduce our traveling around the road. And I've had a number of great friends who are environmentalists say, but I'd love to meet in person. I totally understand that. But right now we're telecommuting and having an interaction that would require all kinds of travel if we weren't meeting virtually. So more and more those who can around their employment should consider telecommuting and non-travel options. And also we need to think about the equity and the fairness of our transportation system and the ability that people have to work from home, et cetera, because there's a lot of people who just can't afford that. And a lot of times they're traditionally disadvantaged communities. So in our response, we need to look carefully and critically at life cycle of these various alternatives we're using, but we also need to look carefully and critically at the fundamental underpinnings of our society and how unfair they are, and develop economic and fiscal and legal methods, as well as just social cooperation to address the inherent injustices that are out there so often we see in environmental issues.
Randy, I think that's both of you the great answers, and Randy, the social justice component of all of this. For many of us, we have the privilege of being able to make some of these decisions, and a lot of people don't. And or we are making decisions that we think are going to be beneficial from a global standpoint, but maybe they're not. In the case of the luxury electric car, yeah, good for you. You're really not having an impact, but you think you are. So you really doing the again, we talked before this call, doing the self-analysis internally. Do I have the right intent? Are my actions really being effective in a global sense? And how can I help other people reach a similar level of effectiveness if they are? Yeah, those are great. I've got a couple of other questions here, folks, and then I think we're gonna close it. Just some commentary from other attendees. There's some dilemmas with green energy, such as wind turbines, in that they result in unsustainable fatalities of birds, and depending on the location, raptors and bats included. Not that a bat's a bird, but raptors and bats. So again, we're trying to, these are complicated things. One of my favorite lines from Ken Burns is the documentarian. He's got a neon sign in his studio that just says it's complicated. And it's true, whether you're making a film about history or whether you're trying to solve environmental issues on a global scale. None of these are silver bullets, and none of them are going to be easy. So I think, that's just keep keeping at it. Thank you both for being here. Again, big thanks to Congressman Huffman. I am so impressed with all of you, and thank you attendees who joined us via Zoom and also on the Facebook streaming session. We had, I think, combined, we had well over 100 folks join us today, and we will have a follow-up email and some follow-up Facebook posts online.